You can't imagine what this little girl went through. I think you'll be surprised to learn about everything she had to go through. Please watch the full video to get a better understanding of the life of this 10-year-old granddaughter and her grandfather. Before continuing, subscribe to the channel, leave your like, and tell us in the comments where you are watching from. The light that streamed through the kitchen window that morning didn't hold the promise of an ordinary day. Usually, the first rays of Montana sunlight would draw golden patterns on Samuel's hardwood floor, a silent invitation to the routine of feeding the animals and tending the land. But today, the light seemed pale, almost hesitant, as if it knew the weight of the day. Samuel had been up for hours, but he hadn't gone out to the barn. Instead, he stood at the sink, staring out at the vast fields, his large, hard-working hands clenched into fists on the formica countertop. He wore his best plaid shirt, the one he usually saved for the rare trips to church. The smell of fresh coffee hung in the air, but neither of them had touched their cups. It was a different kind of silence than usual, one filled with the peace of nature. This was a thick silence, a vacuum filled with palpable anxiety, the kind of stillness that precedes a violent storm. Lily sat at the kitchen table, fully dressed since 6 in the morning. She wore a simple blue dress that she had chosen herself, because blue, she had once explained to Samuel through a drawing, was the color of the cloudless sky. Her feet, shod in shoes she rarely wore, did not reach the floor, swaying in a slow, steady rhythm, a pendulum of restrained nervousness. In her hands, she turned a small piece of sanded wood, a remnant from one of Samuel's woodworking projects that she had adopted as her talisman. Her eyes, a deep, observant blue, were not focused on anything in particular, but seemed to absorb the tense stillness of the room. She had not asked for breakfast, and Samuel had not offered it. They moved in a choreography of mutual understanding, knowing that normal routines did not apply today. Today, they would leave the safety of this farm, this sanctuary they had built together, to enter a world that did not understand her silence or his restrained fury. The ride in the old Ford pickup truck with its faded paint and familiar smell of hay and oil was usually Lily's favorite part of the day. She liked watching the plains stretch to the horizon, counting the telephone poles that passed like silent sentinels. But today the truck felt like a metal cage leading them to the slaughter. Lily was pressed against the door, her face turned toward the window, but her gaze was blank. The passing landscape was a blur of greens and browns. With every mile that took them away from the dirt road and closer to the asphalt of the city, the tension inside the cabin grew. Samuel gripped the steering wheel with unnecessary tightness, his knuckles white against his sun-beaten skin. He didn't turn on the radio as he sometimes did to listen to old country songs. The only sound was the steady roar of the engine, a noise that seemed to tell the story of their own anxiety, a countdown to the moment when they would have to face an enemy they couldn't see but whose presence was already suffocating them. As they reached the center of town, the county courthouse loomed before them like a fortress. It was a red brick building with white columns, a symbol of order and law that seemed completely out of place in the organic reality of farm life. To Samuel, this building represented failure. The failure to protect his daughter years ago, and now the terrifying possibility of failing to protect his granddaughter. He, a man who understood the language of the land, the seasons, and the animals, felt illiterate in this world of written laws and manipulated truths. He looked at Lily, at the way she slumped in her seat, and felt a surge of protective love so intense it made him sick. He was an old man, with an aching back and calloused hands. What chance did he have against a rich man with expensive lawyers and a well-woven web of lies? At that moment, he was not Samuel the farmer. He was the only wall between Lily and the abyss. Stepping out of the truck and onto the concrete sidewalk was the first shock. The city air smelled different, a mix of exhaust fumes and hot asphalt. The sounds were an assault: honking horns, the hushed murmur of pedestrians, the distant siren of an ambulance. To Lily, whose senses were attuned to the whisper of wind and the clucking of chickens, it was a deafening cacophony. She instinctively grabbed the hem of Samuel's jeans, a small, desperate gesture for a familiar landmark. As they walked through the heavy glass doors of the courthouse, the outside world was abruptly cut off, replaced by an artificial silence and a chilly air that smelled of disinfectant and dust. The sound of her own footsteps echoed off the polished floor, amplifying her presence and her vulnerability. They were in enemy territory, a place where Lily's complexity would be seen not as a quirk, but as a flaw. They spotted him almost immediately. Across the wide lobby near a row of wooden benches stood her stepfather. He was talking to a man in an impeccable suit, his lawyer. To the casual observer, he was the picture of sophistication and concern. He wore a navy blue suit that exuded power, shoes that gleamed under the fluorescent lights, and a gold watch that glinted on his wrist. He gestured calmly, his face set in an expression of dignified seriousness. He seemed a model citizen, a man of means and character. But the moment Lily's gaze met his, the facade fell away. To her, the expensive suit was the monster's armor, the tight smile the mask that hid the cruelty, and the glint of the watch a trigger for memories of dark nights and a fear so deep it could not be heard. She froze, her hand still clutching her grandfather's pants, her entire body transformed into a statue of ice. Lily's mind didn't process the sight of her stepfather into coherent thoughts. Instead, it was a sensory explosion. The smell of disinfectant in the air was suddenly overshadowed by the phantom scent of his aftershave, a scent that to her was inextricably linked to panic. The echo of his footsteps in the foyer became the heavy, deliberate sound of his shoes in the hallway of her old house. A chill ran down her spine, the same chill she'd felt when he'd entered her room without knocking. The visual world in front of her began to distort, the edges darkening, as if she were looking through a tunnel. All her focus was on that distant figure, the source of a trauma that her brain refused to organize into a logical narrative. To ground herself, her free hand began to drum lightly against her thigh, a quick, secretive rhythm, a desperate attempt by her nervous system to create its own order amid the chaos that was encroaching on her. Samuel felt the stiffness in Lily's body and followed her gaze. The sight of the man across the hall, so calm and confident, lit a flame of cold fury in his chest. It was pure hatred, unlike any anger he had ever felt. It was not hot and explosive, but cold and heavy, like a block of granite in his stomach. He felt the urge to cross the hall and confront him, to use the strength of his hands, which had been used only for building and cultivating his entire life, to destroy this man. But he looked down at the top of Lily's head and the fury receded, replaced by an overwhelming protective instinct. He moved subtly, a small step to the side, positioning his body so that it blocked Lily's view. It was not a grand or dramatic gesture, but it was a statement. He was the shield. In that moment, his large, aging body was the only thing that stood between his granddaughter's fragility and the source of her pain. A woman approached them, a folder tucked under her arm. It was their lawyer, a young woman named Sarah, assigned by the public defender's office. Her eyes looked tired, but there was a spark of determination in them. She gave Samuel a respectful nod before crouching down, a slow, deliberate movement to Lily's level. "Hello, Lily," she said, her voice low and calm, avoiding the high-pitched, falsely cheerful tone so many adults used with children. "I'm Sarah. We talked on the phone, remember? Today I'll be here with you and your grandfather. The three of us are a team." Lily didn't respond, didn't even look at her, her focus still on steadying herself. But the fact that Sarah had crouched down, that she had gotten down to her level instead of talking down to her, was noticeable. She didn't try to touch Lily or force a response. She simply presented herself as an ally, a calm presence in the midst of the storm, and that in itself was a small act of respect that set her apart from everyone else in that place. The wait was the worst part. Sitting on a hard, uncomfortable wooden bench, time seemed to stretch and twist. Each minute was a small eternity. The large clock on the hallway wall ticked loudly and steadily, each second a small hammer blow to the already unbearable tension. People passed them, some hurriedly, some shuffling, anonymous faces in their own dramas. To Lily, the world had shrunk to that bench. Samuel, feeling the anxiety vibrate in the small body beside him, reached into the pocket of his denim jacket. He pulled out the piece of sanded wood she had left in the truck. It was a block of cedar, with its smooth grain and a faint scent of the forest. He placed it in Lily's hand, closing her fingers around it. He said nothing, but the wood was warm to the touch, its texture familiar. It was a piece of home, a fragment of her grandfather's safe workshop. It was a tangible reminder that no matter what happened, there was a safe place to return to. The sound of a door opening and the voice of a bailiff calling their case number broke the monotony of waiting. Case 207. Custody of Lillian Hayes. Her name, spoken aloud in the sterile surroundings, sounded strange, as if it belonged to someone else. Samuel felt Lily shrink into his side. The time had come. He stood, his body feeling the weight of his 70 years, and gently tugged at Lily's hand. Crossing the threshold of that courtroom was like being swallowed up. The air inside was even colder, the light dimmer. The room was paneled in dark wood, which seemed to suck out all sound, creating a heavy, claustrophobic silence. It was a place designed to intimidate, to assert the power of the law over the individual. And they, an old farmer and a silent girl, had never felt so small and insignificant as they did in that moment, standing in the doorway with all eyes on them. From Lily's perspective, the courtroom was a nightmare of geometry and power. The judge's desk, raised on a platform, was a mountain of dark wood from which authority emanated. The flags of the United States and Montana flying on their golden poles were like banners of an army to which he did not belong. The long tables of the prosecution and defense created narrow corridors, like a maze designed to confuse her. The jury boxes, empty for this custody hearing, seemed like a row of silent ghosts, ready to judge her. It was a space of straight lines, sharp angles, rigid order. Everything here was the opposite of her world on the farm, which was made of the gentle curves of the hills, the organized chaos of the chicken coop, the freedom of the open sky. She clutched Samuel's hand tighter, the piece of cedar wood pressed against her palm, a small piece of her organic world, safe and secure amidst this jungle of rules and formalities. Sarah led them to the defense table. The chair was uncomfortable, hard and cold against her legs. The table was so high that she could barely see over it, which only added to her sense of being trapped. Slowly and carefully, she placed her cedar block on the polished surface of the table. The small block of wood, with its soft scent and natural texture, felt like an act of silent rebellion in this sterile environment. It was her flag, her only piece of territory. Samuel sat beside her, a mountain of outward calm. But beneath the table, his leg was shaking uncontrollably, a nervous tic he could not control. He, a man who had endured blizzards, droughts, and the loneliness of widowhood, was terrified, not for himself, but for her. The system that was supposed to protect her seemed designed to crush her, and he felt completely powerless to stop it. "All rise!" The bailiff's voice rang out like a gunshot. The abrupt sound made Lily jump in her chair, and Samuel quickly placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. The judge entered through a side door, an imposing figure in his black robes. He stepped onto the dais with an economy of movement, his eyes sweeping the room with a neutral expression. He didn't look cruel, but he didn't look kind either. His face was that of a man who had seen it all, a man for whom this drama was just another lawsuit and a long day's work. This impartiality was, in a way, the most frightening thing. He wouldn't see Lily as a terrified child. He would see her as the minor. He wouldn't see Samuel as a desperate grandfather. He would see him as the defendant. And he wouldn't see the stepfather as a monster. He would see him as the petitioner, a man with legal rights clearly outlined on a piece of paper. The hearing began, and the words that filled the room were like a foreign language. Petitioner, respondent, legal custody, best interests of the child. The stepfather's attorney stood, his voice an instrument of persuasion, calm and resonant. He began to paint a picture of a grieving man whose only desire was to honor the memory of his deceased wife by caring for the daughter he loved as his own. He spoke of Lily's instability, subtly suggesting that life on the farm with an elderly grandfather was not the structured environment she needed. Each sentence was carefully constructed, a brushstroke in a masterpiece of deception. To those who did not know the truth, his logic was impeccable, his intentions noble. Samuel listened to it all, feeling the poison seep into the room, distorting reality, transforming his sanctuary of peace into a place of neglect. Samuel's urge to stand up and scream was almost physical. He wanted to interrupt this polite speech and tell the judge about the first time Lily had ever smiled, a genuine smile while a chicken ate from her hand. He wanted to show her the drawings she had made, which told a story far truer than any words this lawyer could say. But he knew that a fit of anger would only make him look like an out-of-control old man, confirming his opponent's narrative. So he forced himself to stand still, his hands on the table, and focus on a spot on the wall behind the judge. He transformed all his fury and frustration into granite stillness. He had to be Lily's rock, the constant in the midst of this storm of lies. The hardest battle he was fighting was not against the system, but against himself, against his instinct to fight the only way he knew how, directly and honestly. When the stepfather was called to the stand, he walked to the witness stand with practiced gravity. He swore to tell the truth, his hand on the Bible, his face a mask of sincerity. Answering his lawyer's questions, his voice was soft, tinged with a noble sadness. He spoke of how sensitive Lily was and how she needed professional care that an elderly farmer could not provide. He described the love he had for his late wife and how her dying wish was for him to take care of the girl. In a moment of pure theatrical performance, he looked directly at Lily and said, "I only want the best for you, honey. I miss you." The words, to an outsider, would have sounded like those of a loving father, but to Lily they were a veiled threat. Under the table, his fingers gripped the cedar log so tightly that the edges began to dig into his palm. The physical pain, a welcome distraction from the emotional pain his words inflicted. Judge Thompson watched the case unfold with meticulous attention. He was a man of the law, a servant of facts and evidence, and the facts, on paper, were clear. There was a legal document, signed by the mother, granting guardianship to the stepfather. The man was financially stable, handsome, and articulate. The grandfather was elderly, of modest means, living in a remote rural area. The case seemed simple, but 30 years of court experience had taught Thompson that the truth was rarely so simple. He looked at the girl, Lily. She had not said a word, not even looked up, but her body screamed. The rigidity of her posture, the almost imperceptible swaying, the desperate grip on a piece of wood. This was not shyness. It was terror. The law required hard evidence, testimony, evidence. But his intuition, honed by decades of observing human nature, told him there was a story here that the documents did not tell. Sarah, the defense attorney, did her best. She stood and spoke with a passion born of conviction. She had no physical evidence, so she presented what she had, the story of Lily's transformation. She described the girl who had arrived at the farm, an empty shell, and the girl who had slowly begun to blossom under her grandfather's care. She presented Lily's drawings as evidence, the dark, menacing figures she had made before, and the drawings of smiling chickens and sons she was making now. Your Honor, this is not just a question of legal documents, but of safety and well-being, she argued. But the stepfather's attorney was quick to dismantle her arguments. Feelings are not facts, Your Honor. Drawings are not testimony. What we have here is a well-meaning grandfather who is clearly alienating the child from her legal guardian. Samuel's heart sank. Their truth, so clear and real to them, seemed to dissolve in this skeptical environment. Finally, the moment everyone had been dreading arrived. Judge Thompson set his glasses on the desk and stared straight at the defense table. His voice was calm, but it filled every corner of the silent room. "Lillian Hayes," he said, using her full name, which made it all the more formal and intimidating. "Lily, I'd like to ask you a question." All movement in the room stopped. Sarah placed a reassuring hand on Lily's shoulder. Samuel held his breath. The judge leaned forward a little. "My dear, is there anything you'd like to say to this court? Anything at all?" The question hung in the air, heavy and impossible. Every eye in the room turned to the small figure sitting in the too large chair. The weight of that collective gaze was crushing. Her future was in her hands, but the words to shape it were locked away where even she couldn't reach. The silence that followed was the loudest the room had ever heard. The silence that settled over the room was a living entity, a pressure that pushed Lily inward. In her mind, words were like shards of glass, impossible to put together into a sentence. Talking about what had happened would mean giving form to the monster, taking the shadow from the dark corner of her mind and placing it under the cold light of that room, for all to see. It would mean reliving the smell of his aftershave, the sound of his shoes in the hallway, the feel of his breath near her face. How could she translate a terror that lived in her body and her muscles on her skin into a language she could barely use on the best of days? The silence stretched for a minute, then two. Her stepfather's lawyer, a man named Peterson, began to smile at the corners of his mouth, a smile of imminent victory. He looked at the judge as if to say, "Case closed." The girl, as expected, was a useless witness. Samuel felt Lily's panic as if it were his own. He could see his granddaughter drowning in that sea of silent anticipation, and knew he had to do something, but he couldn't force her to speak. To force her would be to become like him. Then, in a gesture that was almost imperceptible to the rest of the room, he reached across the table. He didn't touch her right away. He just let his hand hover near hers for a second before resting his calloused fingertips on the back of her small, cold hand. It wasn't a squeeze. It wasn't a caress. It was just a touch, a physical presence that said without a sound what his heart was screaming. I'm here, little bird. It doesn't matter what you do or don't do, if you scream or if you remain silent. I'm not going anywhere. My love isn't in this judgment. It's already yours, unconditionally. The warmth of Samuel's hand was an anchor. With that simple touch, he pulled her back from the brink of panic. The fear didn't go away, but suddenly it had a limit. It was a reminder that she wasn't alone at that table. With a painful slowness that took all her willpower, Lily lifted her head. Her eyes, wide and frightened, ignored the judge, the lawyers, the entire room. They sought and found her grandfather's face. And in Samuel's gaze, she didn't find the anxiety she felt in everyone else, didn't find the pressure of expectation. She found the same calm, patient expression he wore when he tended a sick plant or fixed a broken fence. It was a look that said he would wait as long as it took, forever if necessary. In that gaze, Lily found solid ground to stand on. A spark of something new flared inside her. It wasn't quite courage. It was more a fragile determination not to disappoint this man who had never demanded anything of her. She took a deep breath, the air scratching her dry throat, and opened her mouth to speak. The movement itself was a victory, but the words wouldn't come. A small, choked sound escaped, more a sob than a syllable. She tried again, her jaw trembling. Attorney Peterson stood. Your Honor, with all due respect, the child is clearly not fit to testify. This is a waste of time. But Judge Thompson held up a hand, silencing him. His eyes hadn't left Lily's face. Give her a moment, counselor, he said, his voice surprisingly soft. He saw the monumental effort going on here. He saw the battle. And for the first time that day, he chose to wait. It was at that very moment of tense silence that a new sound cut through the air. The loud, heavy creak of the courtroom's main door, at the back of the room. All eyes, irritated by the interruption, turned. Standing in the doorway, framed by the light from the hallway, was a woman. She was middle-aged, dressed in a simple, cheap coat, and clutched a worn purse to her chest like a life preserver. Her face was pale, and her eyes roamed the room with an expression of pure terror, as if she expected to be reprimanded at any moment. To the judge and the lawyers, she was just a lost citizen who had wandered into the wrong room. But Samuel recognized her instantly. It was Maria, the woman who had worked as a housekeeper for his daughter Linda years ago, the woman who had disappeared without a trace just before Lily's condition took a drastic turn for the worse. Maria's appearance sent a shockwave through the room. Judge Thompson frowned, his patience clearly at an end. Attorney Peterson glared at her, ready to order the bailiff to remove her. But it was the stepfather's reaction that told the whole story. For a split second, his mask of calm and fatherly concern shattered. His eyes widened in shock, and a pale flush crept over his tanned face. It was a flash of pure panic, quickly quelled, but not quickly enough. Samuel saw it, and in his heart, a seed of impossible hope began to sprout. He didn't know why Maria was here after all this time, but the other man's reaction was a silent confession. Maria knew something. With hesitant steps, as if walking against a strong wind, Maria entered the room. Her voice, when she spoke, was a tremulous thread, but in the silence of the courtroom, it rang like thunder. Excuse me, Your Honor, forgive me, she said, the words addressed to the judge. My name is Maria Garcia. I used to work for the Hayes family. I couldn't keep quiet anymore. I have to speak. The words hung in the air, such a monumental breach of protocol that it left everyone momentarily speechless. Attorney Peterson was the first to recover. Objection, Your Honor, this is unacceptable. This is a last-ditch tactic, an attempt to disrupt the proceedings. This woman has no part in this case. Her voice was loud, filled with an indignation that barely concealed the rising panic. As Peterson protested, Lily's attorney, Sarah, scrambled to her feet. She saw the flash of fear in her stepfather's eyes and the desperate determination on Maria's face. This was her only chance. Your Honor, she said, her voice clear and firm, cutting through the noise. The defense begs the leniency of this court. If Ms. Garcia has information that is directly pertinent to the safety and well-being of Lillian Hayes, then it is the duty of this court to hear it. The principle of the best interests of the child must, in a case such as this, trump procedural formalities. I ask permission to call Maria Garcia as a rebuttal witness. The request was bold, almost unprecedented, but the urgency in her voice was genuine. She was betting everything on a terrified woman who had just walked through the door. Judge Thompson looked from Sarah to Peterson, then to Maria, who stood trembling near the door. He was a man of rules, of procedure, but he was also a man who had seen enough of human nature to know that the truth does not always come in an orderly fashion. He saw the struggle on Lily's face. He saw the barely contained fury in Samuel's, and he saw the panic in his stepfather's eyes, and he made a decision. He banged his gavel. "Objection overruled, Counselor," he said to Peterson, his voice ringing with a finality that brooked no argument. "The court is more interested in the truth than in formalities. Ms. Garcia, please step to the witness stand." Her stepfather's jaw dropped. The world he had so carefully controlled had just come crashing down. Maria's walk to the witness stand seemed like a mile. Each step was a visible effort. She sat down, and when the court clerk asked her to raise her right hand and swear, she did so with trembling solemnity. Lily watched, her jaw still trembling, but now her eyes were fixed on Maria. There was a flicker of recognition in them. She remembered that woman, the scent of lavender she left on the sheets, the Spanish lullabies she hummed softly. The focus of the room had shifted. It was no longer on the girl who couldn't speak, but on the woman who, after years of silence, had finally decided she could keep quiet no longer. The power dynamics had shifted in a seismic, irreversible way. Sarah began her interrogation with measured gentleness, asking simple questions to calm Maria's nerves. "Mrs. Garcia, when did you work for the Hayes family? Why did you leave your job?" At first, Maria's answers were monosyllabic, her voice a whisper, but slowly, as she revisited the past, a strength began to emerge. She described the house, once a place of light and laughter when Linda was healthy, and how it had become a place of darkness and fear after her illness. She spoke of her stepfather's control, how he had isolated Linda from her friends and family, how laughter had been replaced by constant tension. She wasn't making accusations yet. She was painting a picture, and the colors she used were the gray of sadness and the black of fear. "What about Lily? What did you notice about Lily?" Sarah asked, getting to the heart of the matter. That was when the dam broke. The tears Maria had been holding back began to stream down her face as she spoke. "The girl, she was like a little flower that had been put in a dark room. She wilted," Maria said, her voice cracking with emotion. "She stopped laughing. She started hiding. I'd find her huddled in her closet, and the nightmares. She'd scream in her sleep, but when I went to check, she'd pretend to be asleep. He didn't like anyone coming into her room at night. He said it was so as not to disturb her." The sincerity of her pain was palpable, a cloud of sadness that filled the room and drowned out Attorney Peterson's increasingly feeble objections. "Did you see anything?" Sarah's voice was a whisper. Maria closed her eyes, as if the memory was too painful to bear. "I heard it," she corrected. "At night, after everyone went to bed, I would hear his footsteps in the hallway. Heavy footsteps. He would stop at her door. Sometimes he would just stand there. Other times the door would open. I never heard his voice. I never heard a scream. What I heard was silence, a terrifying silence. And the next day, the little girl would be gone, like a part of her had left during the night. And sometimes, I would find her stuffed animals torn apart, or a broken toy in the trash. She opened her eyes and they were filled with a guilt that had haunted her for years. "Why didn't you report it?" Sarah asked, the question on everyone's mind. Maria looked directly at her stepfather for the first time, and the fear in her eyes was replaced by a flicker of defiance. "Because I was afraid. I'm an immigrant. I'm undocumented." He knew that. One day, I tried to talk to her mother, and he listened to me. He told me that if I told anyone, he would make a phone call and I would be deported. He said I would never see my own children again. He reminded me that to the world, I was invisible. She then turned to the judge. "But today, when I heard about the trial, I realized that being invisible is worse than being deported. I couldn't let him do to her what he did to me, silence me with fear." As Maria's words filled the room, something extraordinary happened to Lily. She was hearing her own story told by someone else. Every detail Maria described, the fear of the footsteps, the broken toys, the terrifying silence, was validation. It was proof that she hadn't imagined it, that she wasn't crazy. The trauma, which had been a chaotic, lonely mess inside her, began to organize itself to make sense. A single tear, the first she'd shed that day, escaped her eye and slid down her cheek. But it wasn't a tear of pain. It was a tear of recognition. The recognition that her pain was real, and that someone else was finally seeing it. She picked up her cedar stick and held it with a new delicacy, no longer as a defense, but as a memorial. Attorney Peterson's cross-examination was brutal, but ineffective. He tried to paint Maria as a liar, a disgruntled employee out for revenge or money, but his aggressive questions only underscored the calm and consistent nature of Maria's testimony. She did not waver. She looked him in the eye and answered each question with the same simple, painful truth. Her story was flawless because it was real. Judge Thompson watched, his chin propped in his hand. He no longer saw a custody case. He saw a pattern of abuse, manipulation, and cruelty. The truth that had once been hidden in the shadows of Lily's silence was now in the blinding light of Maria's testimony. When Peterson finally sat down, defeated, Judge Thompson did not call a recess. He did not need to. He removed his glasses, slowly wiped them, and addressed the courtroom. In my 30 years on this court, I have learned that justice does not always speak the language of documents, he began, his voice grave. Sometimes it speaks the language of fear in the eyes of a child, and sometimes it speaks through the trembling voice of an ordinary person who decides to do the extraordinarily courageous thing. He looked at the stepfather, and his gaze was pure steel. Based on the credible and compelling testimony of Ms. Garcia, this court finds that there is substantial evidence of emotional and physical danger to the minor. Therefore, I hereby terminate, effective immediately, all of petitioner's guardianship rights and grant sole and permanent legal custody to the maternal grandfather, Mr. Samuel Hayes. The sound of the judge's gavel echoed through the room. For a moment, no one moved. Then Samuel let out a sigh, a sound that seemed to carry the weight of years of worry. The tears he had held back so tightly finally came, streaming freely down his wrinkled face. He turned to Lily and wrapped her in a hug. And for the first time in her life, Lily gave herself completely to an embrace. She didn't stiffen, didn't flinch. She buried her face in her grandfather's chest, her tiny hands clutching the fabric of his shirt, her small body racked with silent sobs of relief. She was safe. Finally, she was safe. Across the room, two bailiffs calmly approached her stepfather, who stared at them with an expression of pure disbelief, as if the world as he knew it had ceased to exist. Stepping out of the courthouse into the late afternoon light was like being born again. The sun, which had once seemed hostile, now warmed their faces. The city air, which had once felt polluted, now smelled of freedom. Lily walked beside Samuel, her hand in his, but the grip was different. It was no longer the fearful grip of a lost child, but the relaxed touch of a girl who was going home. For the first time that day, she looked at the things around her, the leaves on the trees, the faces of the people, the colors of the cars passing by. The world, which had been a dark tunnel for so long, was opening up again, full of color and possibility. The storm had passed. They were almost to the truck when they saw Maria, sitting on a bench, wiping away her tears. Lily stopped. She looked at her grandfather, who nodded in understanding. Then Lily walked over to Maria. The woman looked at her, her eyes still red but with a small trembling smile. Lily opened her hand and showed Maria the piece of cedar, the one that had been her shield and her comfort. With a gesture of childlike solemnity, she placed it in Maria's hand. It was a gift. It was a thank you. It was a way of saying, in her own silent language, that Maria's courage had given her the world back. Samuel watched the scene, his heart so full it felt like it would burst. In that simple gesture, his granddaughter had not only found safety, she had found her voice, a voice that was more powerful than any words. He was just an old farmer. She was a girl who didn't use words. Facing a rich and influential man in a court of law seems like a losing battle, doesn't it? But what happened in that cold courtroom, where the law seemed to favor power, forever changed the life of an arrogant man who thought he was untouchable, of a grandfather who discovered a strength he didn't know he had, and of a girl who proved that the deepest courage sometimes doesn't need sound. This story shows us that heroes can be found in the quietest places. What did you think of this journey of overcoming? Leave your opinion here in the comments, tell us where you are watching from, and of course subscribe to the channel and leave your like so you don't miss our next stories.